Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Discover why many of the world's largest organizations innovate securely with Invicti. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. Passbolt is a free and open source password manager that allows your team to store, organize, and share passwords securely. Passbolt is privacy first and highly versatile. It can be installed on-prem behind your firewall, used in a secure cloud, or deployed as a cloud-native application. You can check out the source code on GitHub, extend it with the REST API, integrate it with the CLI or SDKs, and even contribute. Get started with Passbolt for free now. Check it out at securityweekly.com/Passbolt. The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, and prove compliance in audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Daniel Kravelovich about top 10 CI/CD risks and the steps organizations can take to understand and secure their build and deploy pipelines. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, please follow us on LinkedIn for updates across our organization, show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions. And that's a quick intro. No other announcements other than, John, we've got some news to dive into, and we even have news from last week. We always get into fun conversations, good conversations, and sometimes have a list of topics that we're not able to get to every time. So rather than miss the chance again to talk about Azure and all the fun security shenanigans going on over there. Orca Security. Orca and Wiz have been competing about what kind of fun they can find in cloud environments. This is one from Orca, and I think it might be something that you would love to talk about. You want to introduce the CosMiss to it for us?
Well, if you're going to put it that way. Yeah, this is my fault, listeners. We had this on the queue last week, and I'm like, at the end of the recording, I'm like, we're not going to talk about that? What, do you think I'm going to be negative? So let's see. The general sort of lead into this first. So Cosmos DB is actually a pretty great product out of Azure. A very scalable, easy to use sort of key store database. At least that's the way I think of it. And it's used, anyone who uses it, they tend to, I haven't used it heavily myself, but those who've used it are like, oh my God, this is amazing, I have to use it. That said, it's not cheap. But it has the ability to pair up with Jupyter Network. Excuse me, wrong product. Jupyter Notebooks that Microsoft has available. And so they have the ability now to run the notebook within Cosmos DB. So you're sort of looking at what a stored procedure in a way, but instead it's an actual notebook. And we're here, so you can probably guess at some point I'm going to start saying that someone figured out a way to do a remote code execution in the database. And here we are again. And these things are super complex. They're really difficult to get this stuff right. So I get it. I'm not here to grumble and whatever else, but it's a good write-up of once again these two companies, as Mike, you were just saying, Wiz and Orca. They've been having fun just sort of hanging out in these guys' heads for pretty much all year. And here's another example of being able to override code, deleting and injecting code. I don't think this one, if I remember right, was able to cross tenant boundaries. So at least that part of it is okay, like some of the other ones we've had this year. But still, it's It'd be interesting if any of our listeners are, you guys have your data teams are using these products. It'd be interesting to hear, hit us up in Discord. How do you go about, you have something now that is got sort of, I'll say questionable security, but it's a complex product. How about I put it that way? Especially when you've got, a complex database being used with a complex data science platform. We're really getting these are pretty intricate. But what I'm trying to ask is I'd love to hear how do our listeners, how do people using this in production go? Do they, what type of concerns, not so much concerns are on your mind, but how are you going to mitigate some of the concerns of things like this popping up? I suspect some of the folks out there who are using this have some pretty good ideas. It'd be sort of fun to talk about them and hear what's going on, and maybe bring that to a podcast in the future. Because it's something that, I get the power of this, right? It's not just a stored procedure. I was always sort of, I'll say, worried back in the Postgres days when they started adding support for running procedures in other languages in the database. I'm like, that doesn't sound good. And this is sort of a manifestation of that. Jupyter Notebook is basically Python. So you're going to run that against your database. So how do you actually do that in a way that has some level of control around it? Are you running that code through a CI process, a linter or something before you put it into production? Or it'd be interesting to hear how folks are doing that type of thing.
Yeah, I like that take on it too, because one of the aspects of this, just generally speaking, is the Jupyter Notebooks seem like this is a good design to be able to interact and manipulate arbitrary data, especially potentially sensitive data, so it's not being downloaded onto endpoints, laptops, et cetera. So the principles behind this are still solid. It's just that, as we've seen in the past, software has bugs. And in this case, there is, I think, one of the things I will highlight, that it was predicated on getting the forwarding ID, basically a UUID. And if you have that, then you could basically authenticate as that user. The catch is, in order to get that forwarding ID, you had to be authenticated in the first place. So there was a little bit of, I think that was what brought down lowered the potential impact of this. But a really good point that they make in their write-up is that this forwarding ID isn't described as a secret, therefore isn't treated like a secret, and maybe it doesn't have to be treated like a secret, but it's one of those things, as to kind of reinforce what you were just saying now too. Organizations are using Jupyter Notebooks. What do you worry about? How much do you share the code? Share potential things like this, that the forwarding IDs, that you didn't realize could be used or misused. But so some fun there. Some other things, though, not in the grumbling category. I think in the at least not for the researcher. Someone made $70,000 after bypassing a lock screen on Pixels, and this one. Great write-up, really like it. And to me, it brought up a couple, two particular angles. One is just the way that the researcher was able to interact with the Google team, the Google developers, researchers. So initially, the researcher here submitted a bug, came back as the dreaded duplicate, which to bug bounty researchers means, not going to get paid for this. But the researcher was able to hang out at one of the Google conferences, talk to some engineers, walk through the problem and say, oh, by the way, look, actually, whatever work you didn't address this particular edge case. And that's another one of the reasons I like this article, is that doing lock screen bypasses is a very physical, very creative thinking process. You're not putting together bash scripts for it. You're mucking about with your device. And so being able to figure out what a sequence is and how to put a phone in a particular state takes a lot of just your personal time and effort. So there's fun to see that aspect. And before I run out of breath, the final thing is about what the fix for this looked like. Definitely not a one-line fix. But before we get into that, let me give John a chance to add something to this story.
I don't think I have much to add. I think you sort of covered it, at least from what I saw. It's funny because we saw this from two totally different articles. I think I saw, I think Sophos covered it. And just the intro and how they talk about it. I mean, the overall, I guess this is the direct blog post. Yeah. So the way they hinted at it before clicking through to this, it felt a little more, oh my God, end of the world. But it's still not a super easy thing to do. As you said, you have to, be patting your belly while rubbing your head and standing on one foot type thing.
Pretty much.
But at the same time, it's a pretty significant issue that they were able to, I think they've managed to take care of it in a mitigate, or not mitigate, but patch it out in a fairly safe way without getting too well discovered in the wild. A bit of a gaping hole, but glad it was found and fixed and all that good stuff.
All that good stuff, yes. And the reason I like highlighting fixes, we've talked about a few in the past too, is that they're a great educational tool. How did someone decide to fix a problem? Was it just a input validation? Was it a regex? Was it something a bit longer, like in this, that is reasoning through what are the scenarios, what are the other edge cases that might come up, and have some more code that gets in there. So great way to learn, even if you don't develop on Android or don't develop in Kotlin or Java for that matter. But just reading other people's code, I think, is a great way to learn. The NSA, however, would prefer that you stop reading and writing in C and C++. And I think they have a pretty good case for it. I'm not necessarily going to disagree with them either. But it's because I think this is an engineering decision topic. In other words, if you're going to create a new project, probably just go into Rust, something like that. Hang out with Conan, your borrow checkrbarian, who's going to help you with that memory safety, or something else. But we have 5 million lines of code? I can't remember exactly in the Linux kernel that's C. That's not going to go anywhere. Operating systems, if you're building browsers, that's not going anywhere. But we have seen small steps of Firefox is going to pull in a little bit of Rust. Linux kernel's going to pull a little bit of Rust for their future. And I think for those big projects, they're there. And as usual, get out your bingo cards, listeners. Every time we talk about memory safety issues, I always point out, there's plenty of other problems that come up. We could look at the entire crypto space. We had that great chat with Martha and Sandy about Web3 application security. None of those issues were memory safety issues. And honestly, most of even the CI/CD pipeline attacks or the web application problems we see that, the Daniel, that conversation with Daniel, still not memory safety issues. So there's still a lot of other things that there's a huge population of developers out there dealing with other types of flaws. So once again, I'm doing a lot of the talking, John. Yeah, let's hear from you.
The attackers are going to go for the low-hanging fruit. And sometimes that's going to be, you hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Looked like my mute button wasn't working. They're going to go for the low-hanging fruit. So, okay, in some cases that will be, maybe they very easily, very obviously found a buffer overflow or SQLi. But yeah, if they can go for the lower hanging fruit of hey, there's passwords or, S3 private keys in a GitHub repo they can get access to, then they're going to go wander down that path instead. Rust has been on my mind. I'm looking for a project. It's something I want to try and get a better grip on over the rest of this year. So I'm looking for something to build or rebuild in Rust is sort of where my brain is right now. And these things, I think the other thing worth thinking about here is sort of what comes down to what I just said is it's something else you have to learn, which is good and bad, depending on how fast you're trying to get something done. There was and I should have put this in the show notes. Maybe we'll go back and grab it. A new version of Rust came out last week or last week or two, and they added in support for a new generic type. There's a blog post talking about this, and they've got a code sample. And I think I've written Hello World in Rust, and that's about it. And I'm sitting there looking at this code sample going I've gone through my days of coding in different languages, and I've got no idea what that says. It looked a little bit like TypeScript and how they do type definitions But so I'm looking at this going, I couldn't quite wrap my head around what they're doing at first. Coffee hadn't kicked in or whatever. And I go back and I keep reading down, and they have the audacity to say, this makes the code easier to read. I'm like, no, it really doesn't. And that's the other side of this coming into, the NSA saying, hey, go to a type safe language. Okay, that's cool. That's great. But part of that is the type safe language. And I've heard people talk about this. I haven't experienced it yet myself, but a lot of people say Rust has got a bit of a learning curve. So that's something you got to take into account. If you have a language learning curve, is that, as you're saying, going to bring in other weaknesses in your application, I'll say, right? If you're either still learning languages as you're developing the program, or you don't have a firm grip on it, or maybe your senior guys do and your juniors don't, a little bit of foreshadowing around code review, but that can be a bit of an issue, right? So I think it's not just grab the Rust brush and paint it and everything's going to be happy again.
No, and I've done some C++ template programming in the past, so I've gone through that pain. So I'm willing to read about some Rust, so I don't mind. But I think listeners, what would be some suggestions for John to re-implement in Rust? And some of the two other notes I had about this article were thinking there are two examples that come to mind of good C projects. Like SQLite, well-tested, has been secure over a long time, and libcurl, very well-known, battle-hardened, rarely get vulnerabilities in there. But one of the aspects of those is that those are legacy programs. They've had very heavy engineering investments, very well-maintained. So maybe that's also the case in point that there's a lot of work to put into keeping C secure, keeping it well done. So maybe those trade-offs with those learning curves could be helpful. But John, you also mentioned, before we get into code reviews, some of those easy vulnerabilities. And I think between the two of us, we have a handful of them. Now, I have one of my favorites, some path traversal, but let's throw over to you about some SQL injection and some other easy vulns that you gathered this week.
Let's see, we've got two. Well, I'll stick with the first one. So some vulnerabilities were found in WordPress e-commerce module called WooCommerce.
How shocking.
And then partially the reason I'm throwing this up here is really just sort of, we haven't talked too much about SQL injection this year. I think we said probably about a month ago, hey, SQL injection is sort of going away. We've taken care of that one. Well, maybe not quite. So in this article, they mentioned, like I said, say a few. There's some 9.8 out of 10s on the criticality scale. I was reading something last week talking about, what should we be really focusing around that? We can have that discussion. We've had that discussion. We can have that discussion again in the future. But, it's just sort of a reminder that, CSRF, SQL injection, a lot of these things are out there. A path I want to go down on the previous segment, we ran out of time. This CI/CD Goat is using Jenkins, which pretty much like clockwork right now on a monthly basis, there's a new list of vulnerabilities in Jenkins plugins. So that could be interesting to think about when you're working with that that Goat, or maybe as he starts doing new implementations, new functionality is don't focus so much on the CI/CD itself, but like some of the modules, some of the plugins which you're using with that, and how do you update those and keep track of them? That can be sort of interesting to think about. But we know about WordPress, and WordPress core has gotten a lot better. The plugins are finally starting to get better, but this is a large developed package which still has some issues in there. So we're not 100% secure just quite yet.
Yeah, and I think, and that's where what I'd be curious is looking at the age of the code where those vulnerabilities were found. Were these in dusty corners that haven't been rewritten, looked at in a long time, or is that actually net new code, written within the last 1 or 2 years? Which, if so, this is where I just have to let out a very, very long sigh that, yes, you're right, John. This is still a lot of these simple problems still coming out here. Speaking of simple problems, too, some research from Clarity. This was the path traversal that they found in some firmware inside of industrial IoT, so IIoT and operational technologies, some fun stuff. But what's neat about this article is not so much path traversal, .. Yes, I love it. But it reminded me that we sometimes possibly skip over some of the tools that are helpful for doing this type of work. And what was neat about this research, they did not go out and buy their own oil and gas refinery in order to pick apart some of these tools. What they did was just spend some money on a Raspberry Pi, a little bit easier, and muck about with the firmware. So they actually binary patched the firmware so that they could spoof that it was talking to some sensors. Pretty interesting, because that way now the firmware is going to operate essentially as it would in the field. And then with that, they did some network capture. They did some binary reverse engineering. And in the show notes, I just threw a reference into Wireshark, basically the go-to tool for doing network analysis, network capture, and Ghidra, which is speaking of NSA, which was the Java-based reverse engineering software that they released 3 or 4 years ago. Forget my timeline there. Readers help me out, or listeners help me out. And one of the things Clarity didn't mention was what reverse engineering software they used. But I just wanted to basically throw that in there as a reminder, perhaps to myself and as a resource for listeners about that we should be covering tools as well. So, John, I know you play around with Raspberry Pis quite a bit, or I know you like them. Not sure if there's something else you'd want to throw into that tool chest, or if there was something kind of fun about this research that stood out to you.
The part that did catch my eye, I thought that was pretty neat. They ripped through really quickly. It sort of went from, at least when I was looking at the article, we got firmware, we got a Pi. All of a sudden, the Pi is emulating it. I'm like, wait, it feels like it left a step or two out there. But the rest of the article, I thought was actually really good. Like you're saying, it walks through how did they, and we're obviously a fan of these type of articles on our posts on here of like where they sort of walk you through and say, hey, here's this tool, and they might not show you, okay, step one, load Wireshark. Pick your interface, start sniffing. Okay, then go and have it actually follow that. So they're not walking through every single step in here how to do this, but still, it's. I think there's enough there to get you to sort of, if you're curious, to sort of help you along the way of tinkering with that, and I think that's pretty great. Anything else to cover on this one? No, I thought it was a decent write up. I think that idea has a lot of legs. It'd be probably interesting to talk with Paul on this one, right? Of like grabbing random firmwares and emulating them either on Raspberries or another ARM-based system, or maybe something else that can emulate the ARM chipsets. So I know folks are doing that to a degree, but it sounds like it's an area where we can put a lot more effort into. You don't have to worry about, as you were saying, buying the whole oil refinery.
Yeah, and I think in their write-up, if I remember correctly, they said they took about 4 hours to do that binary patching, which honestly sounds pretty impressive. So kudos to them for that quick work. We'd love to hear more about that. And yes, Paul's Security Weekly, Paul is getting into a lot of hardware firmware, so we'll have to get him on and talk about some of that.
Yeah, real quick on that one. That's something I wanted to point out was, and they talk through like you can't expect this stuff. Even if it is, a matching binary for your chipset, your CPU architecture, God knows what that thing has. If it has custom stuff in their box, it's not going to run the first time. But like that doesn't mean give up, right? So okay, well, what do we do? How do we go through and sort of, how can we adjust this and try again? And I think that was one of the interesting points in this article. Is like it's again something we're fond of, but like these things aren't going to work right the first time. So how do you tweak, sidestep, attack again, that type of thing? So I thought that was pretty neat.
It is. Some other neat things of tools is you've got not exactly a CLI tool here, but a threat spotlight on some protocol, some service being used by phishing and malware that caught your interest there, John.
Yeah, and this isn't a vulnerability. It's not AppSec, but I still, something about it sort of triggered in my mind that it'd be worth talking about for a few minutes. And so what's going on is the folks at Cisco Talos have figured out that some of the malware campaigns are starting to store not so much the data, but their payloads in IPFS, in an interplanetary file system, for those who haven't heard of it, which is a distributed file system based off Web3 tech. So somewhere in around here, if we keep digging, we'll mention the word blockchain. So I think we were talking about bingo cards earlier, so we've now taken care of that one. But so the reason I'm mentioning this is partially to what I just did, right? Sort of blowing it off because, it's Web3. Somebody had to be good enough to recognize when they saw this pattern of either network traffic or access going on from the system of like, oh, they're actually storing something in IPFS. So we can't be jack of all trades or master of all trades, but still I think it's worthwhile, not acting like we know everything or that our tech that we're using or selected is the best, but like, what is the other stuff out there? And it's partially just as a, folks interested in tech or our industry, but also from the point of view of, how do you know if there's something better out there that you could be using? Or how do you know if there's something out there, maybe there's some part of your application or a framework you're using that the bad guys have realized is there and they can actually start leveraging. So it's sort of a, what I'm trying to get across is the idea of be aware of what's going on around you. not just at work or at the day job or the hobby, but like sort of in this industry of like what's out there, what can be used. Does that give you ideas to sort of, maybe improve things yourself? I'm sort of known usually every 6 months or so, I'll go back through some of the tech I'm using and I'll look to see if hey, is there a better way of doing this yet? Do I still have to use this, whatever the framework is? And I don't do it with everything, but like, what's one I did recently? Although it's mentioned in one of the things that CI/CD Goat is using is local cloud, which is a container image that in theory allows you to emulate Amazon AWS on your local machine. Sounds neat, but it's actually a massive resource hog. So every now and then I'm looking, can I figure out how to run some of my lambdas locally and things like that? So it's, it's just good to remind ourselves to not sit static, which that works for some people, but not for all of us.
No, I love that. And, I like the idea of learning as well. I would love to be sort of a eternal college student, if you will, university student. I just don't want to live on a university student budget. But I do like that idea of learning. But I think the other point you're making too is that update your threat models. Threats change. Threats are not static, so we should understand what is out there. And I'm using that as a tie-in briefly to an article from CISA about their talk about implementing phishing-resistant MFA. And really, this is possibly going into the repeating myself once again about FIDO2, WebAuthn. But I think a point here that I just wanted to talk from the AppSec side is the implementing part. It's one thing to say, yes, all of our developers are using FIDO keys. It's another thing to say, oh, wait, does SSH support this? Does this other SaaS app support FIDO keys? Are we building an app for developers or humans? Have we supported FIDO2 or have we supported WebAuthn? So there's also that implementation side of just supporting any type of human authentication. It needs to be implemented. So maybe that's my PSA for this episode.
So I've got a companion story I'm going to add in that I saw last week and I thought was really interesting, but for some reason I hadn't put into our show notes yet. And it's a blog post written by a guy who is down in Antarctica, talking about the complexities of trying to use SMS Multi-Factor Auth when you have no cell phone. So it's an interesting read. He talks about going through like, okay, Verizon has some ways in theory which you can do this over Wi-Fi, and then he tried using Google Voice, and they tried, voice MFA. And so it's interesting reads sort of like, these things, sometimes we'll put the hat on and say SMS MFA bad. But if you take a step back and think about how are your users actually going to be using this thing, whether it's any of those techs, it's like, okay, if they're, in a location where it's just satellite phone or I think they were saying they had the ability to get cell signals, but it was only supposed to be used for like emergencies or something. There was something weird going on there, but I'll post the article for folks to read. And yeah, I thought those two were sort of a neat pair together.
No, I'm going to have, speaking of Antarctica, I'm going to have to post a link to my obligatory documentary about Outpost 31 and the security events that went down there. That'll be an Easter egg for listeners in the know. But John, we've been talking about sort of the building and protecting side of things. You've got an article about some cool stuff coming out of GitHub, and I had two articles about egress filtering at Lyft and some code review comments as well. Let me hit the egress filtering real quick because I wanted just to tie that into our discussion with Daniel. That's one of those aspects of when and if production systems should ever be initiating contact to the outside world. Maybe they're connecting to IPFS to deliver malware or command and control. Obviously, not necessarily good. Other times it might be because they are reaching out to artifact stores and they're pulling down the latest NPM package that is the Russian roulette of let's install this on a production system. So egress filtering is one way to do it, but what this article highlighted, what I liked about this is we can say, have some egress filtering, but then if every single developer, especially large organizations, have to change their app, have to take an action, good luck trying to convince them. So if you can centralize this in some way or make that path easier, so we're doing that Netflix paved road side type of mentality, that's a really successful way. So throwing that out is one successful way of deploying effective controls.
It's an interesting article. I'm a huge fan of egress filtering. I mean, it's one of those things like we've known that this for years, and like it's still not enough people are doing it. It's like, come on, please. When they started talking about Envoy proxy, which is usually used with Kubernetes, my eyes glazed over a little bit because things get complex there. And then my eyes came back in a really sharp focus on a section called explicit proxy, where he's showing an example of defining the proxies, including the username and password in the proxy URL. I'm like, oh, now that's interesting. So I thought that was, and I get it. There's probably not better ways to do that, but still, it's a HTTP proxy, and you're passing the username and password internally, of course, right? Because it'll only be internal. So still a little space to improve, I guess, is my point. But yeah, a tiny thing, but.
No, there's yes. So yeah, we can add more complexity by doing certificate-based access amongst all these systems. But wow, developers are then going to start to get really their heads are going to start to explode about that complexity. And yeah, there are other things. Let's see. We can also talk about GitHub now. Messed up a good segue there, but GitHub is doing some interesting things about bringing basically tools in front of developers. And I think this is one of those, the spirit of what Daniel was also saying in the previous segment, is that it's not so much the application security team that is now the arbiter, the gatekeeper of, I'm going to check all your code, I'm going to use this tool for all your code. I think we've given up as an industry about that as being any type of viable, successful solution beyond just a handful of developers or a handful of artifacts, and say, what if we put this into tools where the developers live? And I think there's some good stuff coming out of here. So what spoke to you from this particular one, John?
So I haven't dug through all the good stuff because the title of the blog is just is everything from GitHub universe. I mean, so small little reading. It's how small is the scroll bar on this one? It's not that small. And it basically there's a lot of, so if folks go to this article, realize that a lot of things in here are links to more deep dives, but they're not underlined or colored. So I think the UX there is a little weird, but so like there's a lot of little simple bullet points. And if you hover over, you realize, oh, that's actually going to a complete separate article just in that one thing, which is why this is a short blog. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. Improved CI/CD, ability to have support for ARM chipsets, which they're saying is for IoT. Okay, it's ARM isn't just IoT, but great. Let's see, on the software development side, CodeQL support for Ruby. I think the one though that really sort of that made me look at this and bring it in here is they're adding support to allow people to send in security vulnerability reports to a project. In the past, if you wanted to do this with GitHub, you'd either have to create an issue and hope that when the maintainer saw it soon enough to mark it as a security thing and then make it private, or just email them directly, see if you could find like a security at alias for that project, which again, not that great. How do you contact the maintainer? So they finally have this in here. And there was one other I saw, which I haven't dug into yet, but there was mention of roadmaps. So there's a lot of stuff in here. It's interesting how GitHub releases some of their new functionality. The one thing I'd love to go and look a little bit further for is to see if they've improved projects, which had a great start last year, and then it seems like they just left it there. It's like, okay, we want a bunch more stuff. So yeah, I'm sure they're going where their user base is throwing money at. So it's being done with intention, the direction of going, but I just wish they did a little more. But still, it's a lot of good stuff in here in this blog post for folks to read and check out and think about how it affects them.
Indeed. And GitHub getting a free an intro to a product review from Mr. Kinsella there, who is available to do other product reviews, as well as perhaps code reviews in Go. Go, of course, our other fun memory safe language is garbage collected. That's how they do their memory safety. And they also rely on developers not to write insecure code, because there's still ways to reach into pointers and reach into C and C++ libraries and make mistakes, as well as just what the code should look like, style guides. So it sounded like, John, you've been playing around with Rust recently, so I can't put you on the spot since you didn't mention Go and say what's your share some of your Go code. Let's review it in real time. But I'm not sure if you checked through this particular page about a list of just common approaches to code review comments, and if there's any here that speak to you or that you find that you'd like to use quite often, or types of code review approach that you take.
Probably could put me on the spot. I've written, I don't know, tens of thousands, definitely thousands of lines of code this year. It's probably some on my public GitHub. I read through this. I got sort of sucked into it, which is why, teacher, I didn't get through all the other articles. It's a good coverage. So I think that the thoughts I have out of this is reading it. So if you're doing code review, this is a good thing for either senior or junior folks. If you're doing Go, to just start, probably maybe even other languages, it'll give you something to think about. It's a think piece, I think, in a way, is the way I look at it from the point of view of, I don't want someone to go through here, study it, and go like, okay, it's an error message. First letter of the error must not be capitalized. One of my guys always tags me on that on code reviews. I'm like, I don't care. But at the same time, I do care a lot about, I want GoDoc function headers on any public function. So some of these things I care about more than others. I think it's good to read through and sort of get a sense of what's there, there's some tricky ones in here, like nil usage. They've got a good link out to a separate blog post on nil and Go. And then the other one I really liked was, I'm not going to see here real quick. There's one or two more. There's some tricky things would start happening when do you pass by pointer versus pass by value, right? If it's a large struct, then you're sending that a lot of times in like a for loop. You're suddenly doing a lot of memory allocation and be much quicker, much more efficient to send a pointer, right? So there's things like that to look for. But I think at the end of the day, what was interesting to me is the automation aspect of this. So for me, a lot of the things which they're talking about, the way I've got my VS Code environment set up, Go format runs every time I save. The spell checking, I don't care about. Complete sentences, I don't care about. But like, there's a lot of things which they have in here. I've got linters running, which will go and like, that'll get highlighted before it even leaves my desktop or my laptop, right? So I think that's one way to sort of be aware of these and think about how can you fix them without having to worry about it in a code review. And then the second thing, I won't mention specific vendors. I'll try to keep it vendor neutral since I've advised and invested in one. But like, I think the build time, the CI/CD time tools, which you can actually start using for free, catch even more of these things, right? And I think the reason I like these two things is it lowers the level of effort that a code reviewer has to do. Imagine, I can't even fit the bullet. Okay, I can barely fit the bullet versions of these from Go format to variable names on one screen in a browser. That's not clicking through all of them. If I had to be thinking about each one of these every time I'm doing a code review, one of my guys' stuff, or anyone's public or anyone's code, good luck. You're not going to remember naked returns as well as package comments, as well as doc comments, as well as don't use panic. Some of these are very obvious. If I see panic in code, I'm going to know it, or I'm going to catch it. Their interface stuff I thought was a little off. You thought I was just going to say one or two words on this topic. But yeah, so I think it's what it really comes down to for me, and we're talking about Go, but probably the same for any of the other languages, is the more of this type of stuff I can automate. If it's common enough that we're able to write a document like this, we should be able to automate it so that, we don't have to worry about stupid humans catching stupid human errors. So that's my 2.5 cents.
Yeah, I'm going to round that up to 3 cents because I did like that aspect of automate just what's easy. So because that just is immediate feedback, and that's you typically automate, I think, the things everyone cares about, or as a group that we think the style is the same. You pointed out some other things that you don't care about, and I think that's the other important aspect of code reviews and style guides is that they are context specific to the culture as well of what the code base looks like. And I think if I were to come up with a hard and fast rule or a more common rule, it would just be consistent. And that's not something that I personally came up with. It's something that I think is common. Write the code so it reflects the rest of what this page of code looks like. And I will, though, then, John, throw back over to you with a question. You mentioned junior versus senior developers going through code reviews. Are there different ways? This particular list of a code review is basically just very not quite objective, but they're very dispassionate items. Do this, do this, do that. It doesn't say necessarily how to approach a code review. And I'm just curious, do you have off the top of your head some ways that you would approach a code review differently, whether it's a junior or senior, in the sense of delivering it, communicating it, or what you would focus on? Because it sounds like you didn't really care about, or I say you don't really care, but the initialisms aren't as perhaps as the more profitable types of discussions, for example.
Yeah, that's a great point. So what I tend, and just the way my brain works is, I usually, after a few code reviews, I pick up the personality of a developer's software development style. And usually from that point on, you can hide the author's names, and I can look at a bit of code and go, oh, that was written by Joe. And that extends out to, at that point, the reason I mentioned that's not a brag, but the reason I mention that is once I recognize either who that is or the sort of the level of seniority of the person writing the code, because again, you can tell how a senior person writes code and how they comment and document it versus someone more junior. You can usually tell pretty quickly. I'd say within 20 lines. So with that, then what I'm going to be looking for is going to change partially with intention, partially automatically. So, okay, and it's probably similar to penetration testing from the point of view of once you get I've talked on here before about the rock climbing analogy of once you get a finger hold in, right? And then being able to sort of get your toe and keep moving up the wall. It's that same sort of concept. If I see something that sort of gets me, okay, this code looks a little more junior, I'm going to start looking for passwords. Or things like that, right? Secrets. So I'll change from looking for the nitty gritty tiny things of, okay, is error handling being done right? Or some of the things in here, the receiver name, receiver types, pass values, how you pass values. I'm not going to be looking so much for the pointers versus, excuse me, values being passed. I'll be looking for okay, have they done just, look for the basic, again, low hanging fruit things. And I'll usually do that for a few reviews. And sort of get them up to speed. You can usually improve people pretty quickly, right? Everyone loves, usually people, love might be a strong word, but they appreciate feedback if it's done correctly and they want to improve and get their stuff better. I suddenly feel like I'm in an interview. But what you see over time is as that improves, then I'll start looking for the more nitty gritty things. Because I don't want to, part of a code review, I want to probably hit depending on how big that PR is, but I only want to hit so many responses back to him. I don't want to send him a laundry list of, here's 3,500 things you need to fix, right? Because that's just, they're not going to learn off of it. The code might get better, probably not. But overall, it's I want to try and hit them with the things which are going to have the most impact as soon as possible. So that's sort of how I go through that. Then the part two of that is, I'm going to try and not keep that code stuck in PR hell where they send in improvements and I'm like, oh yeah, but now how about these 4 things? So you got to try and figure out how do you balance these things. It is a bit of a delicate dance, but the senior guy, yeah, I'll either go, you're good, I know you're good. I'm just going to look and see if you're doing anything interesting that I can learn from, which will happen probably monthly. I'll be like, oh, hey, that's a neat library you found. What was one recently? I can remember one of my guys found a library to do something. I'm like, oh, I hadn't seen that before. That's sort of cool. And I'll put that in as a comment, right? Okay, well, maybe we can use that, start expanding that pattern out more on the rest of the code base. So how I look at these things changes for who and when and why. Yeah, you're right.
Cool. No, yeah, I think that's going to be a wonderful way for us to close out, using code reviews as a learning experience for the reviewer, as well as adjusting that collaboration, that communication approach, depending on how you're conducting that code review. So we'll continue to look for more resources like this, and maybe we'll convince John to share some of his code, and we can do some type of walkthrough through it. But we will also say thank you. We'll say thank you to John for putting himself on the spot and his code. We'll see what his public repo looks like. Thanks everyone for listening. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of Conan the Barbarian, check out some dungeon synth music from synthwave artists like Gregorio Franco and Ogre. And with that, we'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.